Okay, so I have a article I put together here that I wanted to get out as a first newsletter for AvaTorahJudaism, but I didn't do it. I decided to put it here in this video, and this is going to be a couple different videos that I'm going to go over. This is actually going to be, this is a long article, covers a lot of material, but I want to cover some other stuff additionally to this, so this is not the end of this matter. So basically, one mitzvah that defeated Rome. Write this as a memorial in a sefer. So, how one command in the Torah preempted the greatest information war in history. Deuteronomy 31:19, and now write for yourselves this song and teach it to the children of Israel and put it in their mouths. And that's significant, putting it in their mouths. So, a sefer Torah is written on something that was kosher to eat, an animal that was kosher to eat, their hide. And then Exodus 17:14, it says, write this as a memorial in a sefer. Okay, so every mitzvah is prophetic. So there's a principle in Torah study that deserves far more attention than it receives. Every commandment in the Torah is prophetic. The mitzvot are not merely instructions for daily living. They are divinely encoded provisions for circumstances the Creator foresaw long before they materialized in history. The Torah is not reactive, it's preemptive. Just like the waters of the Sota being connected with the virgin birth and all kinds of other things to just show and along the way that, just point some things out. But anyway, when the Creator commanded the Torah be written on animal skin and that every king and every generation maintain a faithful copy of that scroll, he was not issuing arbitrary instructions about preferred stationery. He was building immunity into his people against a form of information warfare that would reach its full maturity centuries later. So this article demonstrates how one commandment, one mitzvah, to write a sefer Torah on parchment, prophetically shielded the integrity of the Torah from the most sophisticated propaganda apparatus the ancient world has ever seen. Starting out, the sacred plant of the empire, papyrus, was not merely a writing material. In the Egyptian world, it was a sacred plant. And this is going to connect right here with the Exodus. Its distinctive three-sided stem, triangular in cross-section, carried deep theological significance. The triangular form of the sacred plant corresponded to the triadic theology that pervaded the Egyptian religion. There was multiple. There was Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And actually, the Christian father Origen is named Origen. His name comes from Horus. So he's actually, his name Origen means the son of Horus. But anyway, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. The endless trinities of the Egyptian theological imagination mirrored in the very cross-section of their holiest plant, papyrus. Papyrus thickets were represented in temple architecture. Columns carved as bundled papyrus stalks supporting ceilings that modeled the heavens, transforming every Egyptian temple in an image of the first creation emerging from the waters. The field of reeds, Shechet Aru, the Egyptian afterlife, was named after it. So consider then the scene at the sea. The Torah calls it Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. When the water split and dry land appeared in the midst of a sea of reeds, the Egyptian army did not flee. They charged in. So readers find this puzzling. What army pursues an enemy into a corridor of miraculously suspended waters? It makes perfect sense if you consider what the Egyptian soldiers saw through the lens of their own theology. Dry land emerging from the waters amid the sacred reeds. This was the primordial mount of creation, the very image their temples were built to represent, materializing before their own eyes. From their perspective, this was not the God of Israel performing a miracle of deliverance. It was the actualization of their own creation narrative, their gods giving over the Israelites into their hands. Their gods, they would have believed, were presenting them a sign. It is worth noting that the Septuagint does not render Yam Suf as Sea of Reeds. It renders it as Urethra Thalassa, the Red Sea, severing any connection between the miraculous overturning of their creation myth and the sacred plant, entirely for the likely audience of the Septuagint. In the Hebrew, that connection is preserved. And in the future, God willing, I'll be able to deal more with the Septuagint and some of the stuff behind it. We will cover it in this article. Very interesting. So, bear with me. Okay, the Torah itself likened to water throughout Jewish tradition, splitting the Sea of Reeds, the Creator's truth breaking through the waters amid Egypt's holiest plant, may foreshadow in miniature the very information war this article describes. The struggle over whose word would endure, written on whose medium, transmitted by whose hand. I believe there's also, with the idea of the story in the Exodus, with the wind blowing to separate over a period of time through the reeds to separate the waters. It wasn't just a boom, the water split, like you see in some movies. There was a consistent wind, and the wind blowing through the reeds. It was connected with one of their female gods that was related with warfare. So it was a complete. The Creator was using their theology to make them they were being blinded by their own theology. Anyway, even the grades of papyrus carried religious significance. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History, so 1371, records that the finest grade was called hieratica, priestly or sacred, because it was originally reserved for religious texts alone. The Nile Delta was the sole source of papyrus production in the ancient world. No other religion could cultivate it at scale. And this is where the story of power begins, not with Rome, but with the dynasty that preceded it. Section 3, Monopoly before Caesar, the Ptolemaic precedent. It is important to understand that the weaponization of papyrus did not begin with Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt understood the leverage that papyrus control provided long before Augustus was born. So Pliny records, and again, Natural History 1370, that when the library at Pergamon began to rival the library of Alexandria, the Ptolemies imposed an embargo on papyrus to Pergamon, an ancient information blockade. This embargo is traditionally credited with driving the development of parchment as an alternative writing media. So like writing on skin. Whether or not parchment was truly invented at Pergamon, the episode reveals that the political weaponization of writing materials was already established practice in the Hellenistic world. So the same Ptolemaic Alexandria that controlled papyrus production was also a major center of literary production. The Great Library, the Motion, and a concentration of scribes, scholars, and copyists without parallel in antiquity, operated under Ptolemaic patronage and Ptolemaic oversight. This is the environment that produced a significant body of literature during the Hellenistic period, including texts whose authenticity has been questioned by scholars for centuries. So Augustus did not invent literary propaganda or the manipulation of writing media, he consolidated it. In a future video, I'm actually going to go back to go back into Egypt and the biblical stories with that and show something related to Pharaoh's dream. But anyway, continuing, section 4, Caesar takes personal control. So in 30, before the Common Era, Octavian, soon to be titled Augustus, conquered Egypt and did something unprecedented in Roman administration. He did not make Egypt a standard Roman province governed by a senator. He annexed it as his own personal estate. So Egypt was administered by a prefectus Egypti, so basically the prefect of Egypt, appointed by and answerable only to the emperor. Tacitus records this arrangement explicitly in his History 111. He describes Egypt as among the arcana how do you say it? I don't know. The rules of the secrets of rule. In the Annals 259, he documents how Augustus prohibited all senators and distinguished equestrians from even entering Egypt without his personal permission. Cassiodeo confirms Augustus did not dare to entrust the land to any senator and would not even grant a senator permission to live in it, except as he personally made the concession to him by name. So why such extraordinary secrecy and control? Egypt controlled two key commodities that gave its owner, Augustus, leverage over the entire Mediterranean world, including Rome, grain and papyrus. So the grain made Rome dependent on Caesar's personal granary, but for our purposes, it is the papyrus that demands attention. So Augustus, through his personal control of Egypt, consolidated what the Ptolemies had pioneered, near monopoly power over the primary writing medium of the civilized world. Papyrus was the ancient world, with the printing press and internet are to ours. The medium through which laws were published, philosophies disseminated, religions propagated, and history written. Control the papyrus, you control what is written, control what you write, you control what is remembered. The effects were measurable. Pliny records that under Tiberius, Augustus' successor, a shortage of papyrus became so severe that the Senate was forced to appoint commissioners to ration it. Otherwise, daily life, this is a quote, excuse me, otherwise daily life would have been thrown into chaos. The man who controlled Egypt controlled the supply of the written word. The prefect in Alexandria, so the Egyptian prefect that he set up over this region he's established as his personal estate, was stationed in Alexandria. He was no mere provincial administrator. He resided in the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the Great Library and an infrastructure of literary production without parallel in the ancient world. Consider what this arrangement meant practically. A man appointed by Caesar, answerable only to Caesar, sitting in the city that produced more manuscripts than any other in the ancient world, overseeing the supply of the very material whose manuscripts were written on. In this context, the convergence of political power, literary infrastructure, and media control in a single city under a single authority, we must evaluate the extraordinary volume of literature that emerged from Alexandria and Egypt during this period and the centuries that followed. And the control was not limited to what was written. Throughout antiquity and the medieval period, existing texts were routinely scraped clean and overwritten, a practice known as a palimpsest. But this goes back to some other issues. But I'll continue. So section 6, what we know was forged. The record. Let us establish a baseline by looking at what secular and classical scholarship has definitively identified as forged literature from the Alexandrian milieu. The record is sobering. The Hermetic corpus. So for centuries, the writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, were treated as genuine ancient Egyptian wisdom predating Plato and Moses. So Renaissance scholars, including Marsilio Ficino, believed them to predate both. So in 1614, the philologist Isaac Casaubon dismantled this fraud in his work De Rubis Sacris et Ecclesiasticus Exercitanios, I don't know, something like that, XVI, so 16, demonstrating through systematic analysis of vocabulary and style that the texts were composed in Alexandria in the 1st through 3rd centuries of the Common Era, over 1,000 years later than claimed. Modern scholarship has confirmed Casaubon's without exception. These texts were Alexandrian productions dressed in the garments of deep antiquity to claim an authority they never earned. So Neoplatonism, a tradition built on forgery. So the philosophical tradition of Neoplatonism, one of the most consequential intellectual movements in Western history, traces to Alexandria through an extraordinary figure. Ammonius Saccas. So he was 175 to 242 of the Common Era. This man left no writings. We know almost nothing about him, yet both Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, and Origen, the architect of systematic Christian theology, are said to have studied under the same undocumented Alexandrian teacher. The invisible teacher produced a visible and verifiable legacy of fraud. The Neoplatonic tradition generated one of the most extensive bodies of pseudepigraphal literature in the Western world. Pseudepigraphal is a scholarly way of softening the blow that a writing is fraudulently attributed. So it's written and it's tried to be associated with a earlier person to give it credence and circulation. It's basically a forgery. So the theology of Aristotle. Entire sections of Plotinus's Enneads, a 3rd century CE work, were repackaged and circulated under the name of Aristotle, a philosopher who had been dead for 6 centuries. This fraud shaped the course of Islamic philosophy for generations until Frederick Dieterse exposed it in 1882. Liber de Causis, the Book of Causes, the work of Proclus, the Athenian Neoplatonist, was stripped of his name and attributed to Aristotle. So this forgery was so successful that it was not detected until Thomas Aquinas himself, upon receiving a fresh translation of Proclus, identified the deception in 1272. Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, an anonymous Neoplatonist of the late 5th century, drawing heavily and often verbatim from Proclus, attributed the entire corpus, divine names, mystical theology, celestial hierarchy to Dionysius the Areopagite, the Athenian convert of the Apostle Paul mentioned in Acts 17:34, thereby backdating his Neoplatonic theology over 4 centuries and clothing it in apostolic authority. So Hugo, I think it's pronounced Koch, and Joseph Stiglmaier independently exposed this forgery in 1895, around 1900. The Chaldean oracles, and this gets back, but this is just documenting a chain. So the Chaldean oracles, hexameter verses composed in the 2nd century CE by Julian Thergist, were presented as the revealed wisdom of ancient Chaldean priests, a claim to Babylonian antiquity they never possessed. These became scripture for later Neoplatonists, and Hans Levy dismantled the attribution in 1956. Imblicus himself wrote his major defense of theurgy, the De Mysteris, under the pseudonym Abmon. a fictitious Egyptian priest to lend his philosophical arguments to the borrowed antiquity of Egyptian sacred tradition. So this isn't a marginal pattern. It is the defining characteristic of Neoplatonic literary production, the systematic attribution of new ideas to ancient authorities who never held them, and Neoplatonism, born in Alexandria, profoundly shaped the institutional Christian theology that would emerge from the same intellectual environment. So we can go on. I will get to some interesting stuff here. Just bear with me. The Gnostic Library in 1945, near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, Muhammad Ali al-Saman discovered 12 leather-bound codices containing 52 treatises, the single largest cache of alternative religious texts from antiquity. So Sethian cosmologies, Valentinian speculations, Thomist traditions, an entire library of competing theologies, not found in Rome, not in Antioch, not in Jerusalem, in Egypt. The donation of Constantine. The pattern extends beyond the ancient world. This forged imperial decree, which purported to grant the Pope authority over the Western Roman Empire, was exposed by Lorenzo Valla in 1440. Through philological analysis, Valla proved that its Latin vocabulary belonged to the 8th century, not the 4th. These are not fringe claims. These are the settled verdicts of mainstream scholarship, in some cases established over 4 decades. Section 7, the European scriptoriums, the scale of the problem. As a matter of fact, scriptoriums, anytime you see this, it seems like there's something fishy going on. It's not just like, we'll get to that. The scale of the problem, the pattern of literary production under institutional authority did not end in antiquity. From roughly 800 to 1200 CE, and even outside of these ranges, the European monasteries operated as the primary manuscript production centers of Western civilization. In his landmark study, Princeton historian Anthony Grafton documents the scale of this enterprise. By one scholarly estimate, from the established science of diplomatics, the authentication of historical documents, 2/3 of all documents issued to ecclesiastics before the year 1100 are forgeries. 2/3. Not a conspiracy, a scholarly consensus. The question every honest scholar must ask is, how far back does this tradition of institutional literary production and forgery trace? The evidence presented in this article suggests it reaches at least to Ptolemaic and Roman Alexandria. So the letter of Aristeas, this is where it gets really interesting, guys. A forgery that authenticated a Bible. With this context established, consider the letter of Aristeas. This document claims to be a letter written by a courtier of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, around 270 before the Common Era, describing how the king commissioned a Greek translation of the Jewish Torah for the Library of Alexandria. 72 scholars from Jerusalem, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, supposedly produced the translation in 72 days. The Jewish community acclaimed it as perfect. The king wept with admiration. Okay, it's a magnificent story. Scholars have known it as a forgery since 1685. Humphrey Hodie, Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford, demonstrated the pseudepigraphal character of this letter in his Contra Historiam Aristeas de Septuagint Inter Tibus dissertation. The evidence is decisive. The Demetrius problem, the problem with the letter of Aristeas. So the letter names Demetrius of Phalerum as the key figure who persuaded the king to commission the translation, but Demetrius was a political enemy of Ptolemy II. He had supported a rival claimant to the throne, and when Ptolemy II came to power, Demetrius fell from favor and died in disgrace. So he could not have been the influential royal confidant the letter depicts. This is not a minor error. It is a fatal anachronism, and there's a lot of those in the New Testament, as a matter of fact. Someday we'll get to those. It is a fatal anachronism, so a proof that the author lacked genuine knowledge of the Ptolemaic court he claimed to serve. So the linguistic problem. The Greek of the letter does not match 3rd century BCE court language. Scholarly analysis dates its vocabulary and style to approximately the late 2nd or early 1st century before the Common Era, 1 to 2 centuries after the events it claims to witness. Apostolic agenda. So did you see where it's dated? At least late 2nd or early 1st century BCE. Okay, apostolic agenda. Victor Terakova of Hebrew University of Jerusalem wrote, modern scholars commonly regard the letter of Aristeas as a work typical of Jewish apologetics, aiming at self-defense and propaganda directed to the Greeks. This forged letter, produced in the literary environment we have described, served a precise function. It granted divine authority to the Greek translation of the Torah, the Septuagint. It's abbreviated LXX. Readers are invited to consider what it means when the foundational authentication document for any translation is a demonstrated forgery. And it doesn't stop there. This gets even... Philo of Alexandria, questions worth asking. The story compounds. Philo of Alexandria, dated by scholarly consensus to approximately 20 before the Common Era to 50 in the Common Era, is presented as a prominent Jewish philosopher who synthesized Jewish scripture with Greek Platonic philosophy. His treatment of a divine mediating logos, a rational pre-existent principle bridging the gap between the creator and the material world, has been recognized by scholars for 2 centuries as bearing striking structural parallels to concepts that would become central to institutional Christian theology. The Logos theology of the New Testament. We'll get to this. No one disputes Philo's importance, but rigorous scholarship requires that we ask the same questions of Philo that we ask of any ancient author. When we do, several anomalies emerge. The attestation gap. So Philo supposedly produced approximately 800,000 words of philosophical prose in one of the most intellectually active cities of the ancient world. Yet as David T. Runia documents in his landmark Philo in Early Christian Literature, a survey, the first, that's 1993, the first writer to extensively cite Philo's works is Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 the Common Era, roughly 150 years after Philo's death. Jennifer Otto of the University of Alberta further observes, although Philo earns a favorable mention from the Jewish apologist and historian, Although Philo earns a favorable mention from the Jewish apologist and historian Josephus within decades of his death, the next surviving reference to him by a Jewish author dates to the Italian Renaissance, like a very long time later. Weigh this carefully. A supposedly prominent Jewish author writing 800,000 words about the Torah, and no Jewish community mentions him for over 1,500 years. His entire literary legacy was preserved exclusively by Christian institutions, the same monastic scriptoriums that, as graphed in documents, produced 2/3 forgeries before 1100 of the Common Era. The earliest substantial manuscripts of Philo date to the 10th and 11th centuries CE, placing them squarely within the era of documented monastic forgery, 800 to 11 CE. So Philo vanished from Jewish memory. He survived only in the libraries of those who found his writings useful. The reader may draw whatever conclusion the evidence warrants. I do want to point out, Philo never mentions any of the rabbis from his day or anything. None of the rabbis. Anybody who mentions it's in Jewish tradition is like people like Moses and Aaron, like people way back in history. The rabbis never mention Philo. They don't know about Philo. How is it that this happens? Unless... Of course. The identity problem for a man presented as a prominent Alexandrian Jew, writing at length about Torah and Jewish practice. Philo is strangely without identity. I actually have a full study on this. Maybe someday I can get to it. It's too big to go over here because he's such a giant in like the philosophy of Philo is so embedded in Christianity that it's so ingrained in the scholarly world. To dismantle that kind of stuff, it takes a lot of work. I'm working on it, but anyway, we'll get to this. The identity problem. For a man presented as a prominent Alexandrian Jew writing at length about Torah and Jewish practice, Philo is strangely without identity. Maren Niehoff of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in her Philo of Alexandria, an intellectual biography, observes, whereas Josephus locates himself on an identifiable trajectory from aristocratic origins in Jerusalem to favored courtier in Rome, Philo's historical writings convey a particular sense of enigma. The reader learns hardly anything about Philo as a historical figure and political actor. Even the one instance where Philo identifies himself in all of his writing, and where he's related to a certain person, that is a problematic passage when you start looking at original manuscripts. We'll get to it someday, God willing. Philo never names his father. He never gives his tribal affiliation. He never anchors himself in the genealogical framework that is constitutive of Jewish identity across every period and community. Jewish genealogical identification is not a formality. Tribal identity determines priestly obligations, land rights, and legal standing. The Mishnah and Talmud are built on name chains of attributed transmission precisely so that every chain can be tested. the double silence. As the historian and lecturer Henry Aberson has noted, there is remarkable mutual silence between Philo and the rabbinic world. The entire corpus of rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, the Talmud, Babylonian and Jerusalem, the Tosefta, and halakhic and Haggadic midrashim contains no reference to Philo. No one. And the silence runs in the other direction as well. Philo, for his part, never mentions any known Jewish figure of his era. No Hillel, no Shammai, no Gamliel, no named member of the Sanhedrin, no Pharisee, no Sadducee, no figure known from any rabbinic chain of transmission. 800,000 words about the Torah and not one named rabbi. The entire rabbinic tradition and not one mention of Philo. Two intellectual worlds that supposedly shared the same scripture, same faith, same century, left no trace of each other's existence. Furthermore, despite his voluminous writings about Jewish law and practice, Philo's corpus is remarkably thin on descriptions of personal observance of the Chagim, the Jewish festivals, pilgrimage festivals, that define Jewish communal and religious life. For a man presented as a leading Jewish figure of his generation, the absence of lived religious experience in his writings is conspicuous. So what I'm talking about is specifically when a Jewish male, when the temple's standing, he's required 3 times a year to go up to Jerusalem. And we do not see that he has any evidence that he's going to Jerusalem. Now, like rehashing some details about priestly service is one thing, but actually talking about going on these trips, it's completely absent. So the manuscript transmission. Philo's works survive in medieval Greek codices, with the early substantial manuscripts dating to the 10th and 11th century CE, approximately a millennium after he supposedly lived. The entire manuscript tradition was preserved exclusively within suspect Christian institutions. No Jewish community preserved Philo's works. The embellishment of the Aristeas forgery. Let's go down that rabbit hole. In his Life of Moses, Philo takes the already forged letter of Aristeas and adds to it something not present in the original. The claim that the 72 translators working in complete isolation from one another produced word-for-word identical translations. That's the embellishment, is that it's word-for-word identical translations. This single embellishment transforms a useful Greek rendering into a text of divine inspiration equivalent to the Hebrew original. The theological utility of this edition is enormous. Okay, so we are not telling the reader what conclusions to draw. We're presenting the evidence that mainstream scholarship has documented, asking, are these the characteristics of a well-attested ancient author, or are there legitimate questions that deserve honest investigation? Okay, now, the archaeological record, a caution. When we turn to the physical evidence, the actual manuscripts that survive from antiquity, a pattern emerges that deserves careful attention. Brent Nungbury of Yale University, in his God's Library, The Archaeology of the Earliest Christian Manuscripts, published in 2018, has demonstrated that much of what we thought we knew about these books and fragments is mistaken. The standard reference works of Kurt Aland and Bruce Metzger catalog the surviving manuscript tradition, and the provenance data tells a consistent story. Provenance is like where the manuscript comes from. The major early manuscript collections, the Chester Beatty Papyri, purchased from an Egyptian dealer in the 1930s, the Bodmer Papyri, the people call this Oxyrhynchus fragments, all traced to Egypt, specifically to the literary environment of Alexandria and its surroundings. So the standard explanation is climatic. Egypt's dry conditions preserved papyrus that would have perished in wetter regions. This is partially true, but the Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin demonstrated that the Judean desert provides comparable preservation. In his excavations at the Cave of Letters in Nahal Hever in 1961, produced the Babatha archive, 35 documents belonging to an ordinary Jewish woman dated 94 to 132 CE, including marriage contracts, property deeds, legal proceedings in Greek, Aramaic, and Nabatean. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived. The Bar Kokhba letters survived. Military correspondence survived. Ordinary legal documents of ordinary people survived, people that lived in the Jericho region, all in Judean conditions from precisely the same centuries and during a time of war. So documents survived in Judea. Jewish documents survived there in abundance. The climate explanation alone does not fully account for why certain categories of documents appear exclusively from one geographic source. So we raise this not to pronounce judgment. We raise it to urge caution. And this is very, very interesting, because the more I dig into this kind of stuff about these early manuscripts, whether they're Dead Sea Scrolls, anything else, it just gets really interesting. Your mind gets blown. So use caution. When evaluating ancient documents, particularly those written on papyrus in or near Alexandria in Egypt, the responsible approach is to accept claims upon supporting artifact evidence and to recognize that provenance matters. Provenance is where it comes from. The rogue medium, animal skin. Against this entire apparatus, the monopoly over papyrus, the literary machinery of Alexandria, the centuries of institutional production, there existed one writing medium that no empire, Ptolemaic, Roman, could control: parchment, animal skin. Prepared animal skin, also known as vellum, when made from calf skin. So unlike papyrus, animal skin could be produced anywhere animals were raised and slaughtered. It was not bound to a single river, delta, empire granary. It was, by its nature, decentralized. It could not be embargoed, it could not be rationed, it could not be made scarce by imperial decree. And the Jewish people were already using animal skin as their primary sacred writing medium, and had been for centuries because the Torah commanded it. The scribal traditions of sofrut, derived from the Torah itself, require that a Sefer Torah be written on gevil or cloth, specifically prepared skin from a kosher animal, not papyrus, not wax tablets, not stone for ongoing transmission, animal skin. The Jewish people maintained a constant, abundant supply of kosher animal hides through two entirely normal features of their daily life: kashrut. The kosher diet required the ritual slaughter of permitted animals, cattle, sheep, goats. Every meal that involved meat produces hides as a natural byproduct, and also the temple service. While the temple stood in Jerusalem, daily sacrifices produced a steady stream of ritually slaughtered animals. So the Talmud discusses the disposition of sacrificial hides. And that's Yoma 35a. And the Creator did not merely provide the material, he distributed the scribes. So the Torah prescribes a culture in which teachers and scribes were woven into the fabric of every community, even the smallest. The tribe of Levi received no territorial inheritance of its own, and this was not a punishment but a provision. Jacob's prophecy, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel, Genesis 49 verse 7, became a teaching function. The Levites were dispersed precisely so that the Torah instruction would reach every corner of the land. And that is also supposed to model the Jews in today when we're in exile. We're scattered all throughout the world for a purpose, for the teaching purpose. Okay, the Creator commanded that 48 Levitical cities be established throughout all the tribal territories, Numbers 35, 1 through 8, Joshua 21, 1 through 3, ensuring that no Israelite community lacked access to those whose calling was the preservation and teaching of Torah. So Moses declared of Levi, they shall teach Jacob your statutes and Israel your law, Deuteronomy 33:10. And the system worked. When King Jehoshaphat sought to educate the nation, he sent Levites throughout the cities of Judah, and they taught in Judah, having the book of the Torah of the Creator with them. 2 Chronicles 17, 7 through 9. This was not a monastic elite cloistered behind walls. It was not a centralized scribal academy in a single capital city, as other ancient cultures maintained. It was a decentralized network of Torah literacy embedded in every town, sustained by the tribe of herdsmen and shepherds who held no tribal territory of their own, and whose very landlessness ensured their presence throughout all of Israel. So the shepherds and everything of each town would be supporting the Levites and the Kohanim that were scattered throughout the land. Unlike the centralized literary centers of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Rome, where scribal arts were concentrated in temples and palaces under institutional control, the Torah distributes its scribes among the people. This, too, ties into the prophetic nature of the Mitzvah. The Creator designated a culture that could not be silenced by conquering a single city or burning a single library. The Creator, in commanding kashrut in the temple service, had among all other purposes guaranteed that his people would never lack the raw material for preserving his word. In scattering the Levites among every tribe, he guaranteed they would never lack the scribes and teachers to write it, copy it, check it, and transmit it. They were structurally immune to any papyrus monopoly. The immunity was built into the commandments themselves centuries before the monopoly was consolidated. Judaism's scribal tradition, verification built into the system. The immunity was not only material, it was methodological. So scribal practices derived from the Torah produce something remarkable, a textual tradition that invites its own verification. So as Emmanuel Tov documents in textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, printed 2012, in Ernest Worthween details in the text of the Old Testament, published in 2014, the Masoretic scribal tradition incorporated quality controls of extraordinary precision. Every letter in each book was counted and the count recorded. Every word was counted. Every letter in each book was counted and the count recorded. Every word was counted. The middle letter and the middle word of each book were identified. Unusual spellings and rare words were flagged and annotated. The ketiv, so that is what is written, that the text actually says on the scroll, was preserved alongside the kere, or the what is actually cantilated or chanted. There we go, recited. What the tradition says should be read aloud rather than silently correcting one to match the other. A tradition honest about its own internal variance. The transmission chain is named the Ben Asher family of Tiberias, the Ben Naphtali tradition, reaching back through the Geonim, the Savarim, the Amoraim, the Tanaim, not anonymous, not institutional, named, and therefore in principle verifiable or falsifiable. Okay, the Targum Onkelos, an authorized Aramaic translation of the Torah from the Tanaic period, exemplifies this ethos of transparency. As documented in Alexander Sperber's critical edition, The Bible in Aramaic, and Bernard Grosfeld's annotated translations, Onkelos is a monument of translational integrity. When Onkelos renders a Hebrew word, he renders it the same way throughout the Torah with remarkable consistency. The relationship between the translation and its source is transparent, predictable, and checkable by any competent reader of both languages. Basically, the Vorlet, like if you read Onkelos, you could literally, if you're knowledgeable in his text, you could know exactly what the Hebrew vorlage is behind every Aramaic word. It's systematic. Vorlage is the original language that something is translated from. Okay, so set this beside the Septuagint, whose relationship to its Hebrew source varies so dramatically between books, so free in some places, so full of additions and omissions in others. Jeremiah in the Septuagint is roughly 1/8 shorter than the Masoretic text and arranged in a different order. Esther and Daniel contain entire passages absent from the Hebrew. That identifying the underlying source text for a given passage is often a major and genuinely contested scholarly enterprise. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a 1,000-year test. Then came the test, everyone. The Great Isaiah Scroll, designated 1Q Isaiah A, was found at Qumran, sealed in a jar, preserved in dry air of the Judean wilderness. It is dated to approximately 125 BCE. The medieval Masoretic manuscripts against which it was compared date to approximately 1,000 of the Common Era, a gap of 1,000 years. When the scroll was unrolled and read, when a text separated by a millennium from its descendant was laid beside it and examined letter by letter, word by word, the agreement was extraordinary. Millar Boros, director of the American Schools of Oriental Research, who first saw the initial publication, wrote, "It is a matter of wonder that through something like 1,000 years the text underwent so little alteration. And it is not only the words that endured. The letter forms themselves, the shapes of the Hebrew characters on that ancient scroll, are so well preserved, so consistent with the scribal tradition that followed, that a Jewish schoolchild trained in Torah reading today can sit before the great Isaiah scroll and read it. When the Dead Sea Scrolls go on public display, visitors who have studied Torah witness something remarkable, a text separated from them by over 2 millennium, written in letter form so faithful to the tradition that they remain legible to this day. The hand did not waver, the letters endured across more than 2,000 years. The Masoretic tradition was doing what it claimed to be doing, faithfully preserving the text across the millennium. You can test it. The scroll predates the tradition matches it. A note on the Qumran finds. It should be noted that variant scrolls, those diverging from the Proto-Masoretic text, are the overwhelming minority of the biblical manuscripts found at Qumran. So Emmanuel Toe's comprehensive analysis classifies approximately 60%, and that number has actually changed over the years, of biblical scrolls as Proto-Masoretic, with the remaining variants scattered across several smaller categories. Many too fragmentary to classify with confidence. Furthermore, the concentration of these variant and fragmentary texts is not evenly distributed across the 11 caves. A disproportionate number come from a single cave location, Cave 4, where approximately 575 manuscripts were found in a deteriorated state, not stored in protective jars as in Caves 1 and 11, but discarded in conditions consistent with a repository for texts that were being set aside rather than actively preserved. So we should remember the concept of the Geniza, a repository where worn or variant texts were stored rather than destroyed. Because Jewish law forbids the destruction of any document bearing the divine name, not everything found in a Geniza represents what a community actively used in its liturgy or study. A variant manuscript stored in a Geniza may have been placed there precisely because it was recognized as imperfect and not destroyed, because the name was upon it, but set aside. The presence of a text does not equal its endorsement. The prophetic provision. So the Creator commanded his people to write his Torah on animal skin. He commanded kashrut, dietary laws, which ensured a steady supply of hides. He commanded the temple service, multiplied that supply. He commanded the scribal practices that built verification into every copy. He commanded the geniza, derived from the mitzvah, connected to respect for his name, which prevented the destruction of any text bearing that name. He scattered the Levites among every tribe, guaranteeing that his people would never lack the teachers and scribes to transmit his word. A decentralized network of literacy no empire could dismantle. Each commandment, taken alone, appears as a practical instruction for daily life. Taken together, they form a system, a prophetic infrastructure for the preservation of truth against an assault that had not yet come. When empires, first Ptolemaic, then Roman, consolidated control over the ancient world's primary writing medium, and then that same medium in that same city were used to produce an extraordinary volume of literature whose authenticity scholars have debated for centuries and in many cases decisively rejected, the Torah was already immune. Written on a medium no empire could monopolize, copied by a tradition that counted every letter, verified across a millennium by a scroll sealed in a jar in the Judean desert, translated with transparent fidelity through Targum Onkelos, transmitted through named chains of custody, verifiable and falsifiable, which is accountable. The mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah was not merely a commandment. It was a prophecy enacted in advance, a divine provision against a war on the integrity of the written word that would not reach its full expression until centuries after the commandment was given. A war that in many respects continues to this day. The Creator saw it coming. He always does. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our Creator stands forever. Isaiah 40, verse 8. It is if one mitzvah, the commandment to write on animal skin, contained this depth of prophetic provision, what might the other 612 contain? What other immunities, what other provisions, what other protections has the Creator built into his commandments that we have not yet perceived, because the threats they address have not yet fully materialized?